My name is Donatas Valis. I am client architect SOA and work for Oracle Consulting in Germany, and I kindly invite you to listen to my presentation about using bean validation with the common data model in SOA. Just a short introduction. I copied from Java 1 site to save time. If you'd like to follow or contact me, there are contact information on this slide. And basically, we work for customers in consulting, leveraging Oracle products. And as a lot of Oracle products are based in Java, so we deal also in Java, and therefore with the standards behind Java EE. And therefore, I prepared a presentation about bean validation, which is one of Java EE 6 standards. The agenda for today, for the session, we'll start with some small overview about challenges in layered SOA, and in the second part, go to focus on how to use bean validation to address one of the challenge, in this case, business constraints. So let's start with the challenges in SOA. How many of you are doing SOA at your companies? So, okay, so I see SOA is still not dead, because 3 years ago it was some kind of analyst article about SOA is dead. Maybe you noticed that. And I also think it's not dead because the principles behind it, they are alive. Yeah, maybe abbreviation is kind of overused. So, but the principles are useful. So, if you're doing SOA, you have normally some layers in your systems. It's normally not monolithic one, but consists of various parts and layers. Maybe not as much as this Lego building, but at least few. So if you look at this diagram, we normally have some components, services, processes. Okay, let's go back. They are consumed on a mobile, desktop clients, browser clients. Your business functionality gets exposed as a web application. You might have also some kind of service bus. Note that there are no specific products in this diagram. It's an abstract one, conceptual one, and illustrates that there are boundaries between system components. So normally they are not on the same JVM, but kind of remote. So you have to address this issue in SOA from the beginning. And if you don't do that, so you might get some trouble on the way to implementation on SOA. We just saw, it's a smaller picture of one part, and the sample application shows implementation of this conceptual architecture. We have 2 services, one business process and web application consuming our services and business process. And if you look at a service interface, what is needed to define a service interface using Java, it's pretty simple. Yeah, you have to provide a name for your service. There might be 1 or more service operations. And one of the patterns in SOA is messaging. So you normally send some data as input message and get some data back as a return message. So over a system boundary. So it's kind of simple. So normally it's difficult to understand why the challenges in SOA, but when we come to some technology explosion of services like web services, remote, so we might get some challenges. And if you think about the best practices at the beginning, it's kind of I think so 8 years or 10 years old. So SOA was very overbloated with and focused on web services, XSD, SOAP, HTTP, but as we come back to the interface, it's not always web service, it's not always SOAP, it's just an interface exposing some business functionality. So the name might be Enterprise API, might be more sexy name for SOA, because we live now in kind of API economy, and the systems you are building for your customers or your products, if you are at a customer site, they need to be open because of various consumers, for example, mobile. Yeah, if you have a closed system, so it might be difficult to integrate some other clients. And as a system is kind of part or of a whole stack, so components need to communicate. So and at the core there is a business functionality, so business interface, business data, and business constraints, which define our SOA. And after that comes the technology, how they are exposed. So let's start to look at the parts, and at the core we have also of our API, we have a kind of service model which contains our process definitions. They are all simple Java interfaces in this sample, but one sample processes report claim. It's from insurance here. I just thought it might be familiar for the audience. There are different service categories. So claim activity service is one of category, and service operation create claim. We have common data. Report claim input is, if you remember, it's the previous slide, it's a message which is sent to create claim service, and it composes two common data objects, claim and person. And here comes a need also to address business constraints, because if you don't do that in a model, they can be expressed in a model, they are part of business functionality, and if you don't do it, they tend to spread across all layers. So implementation, enforcement, and validation of them might get time-consuming and difficult to implement. Here we see some one process from a sample application for the session, defined in Java, it's a Java interface, and it illustrates the idea of service orchestration. So it orchestrates two business activity services. Yeah, if we report a claim, we normally have to provide the claim information about the accident, and the second part in the sample is a person reporting a claim. So here we come to a common data model. It's a kind of vocabulary for our enterprise API. So the pattern behind it, it's an old data transfer object pattern, and it uses composition to compose data to a higher level objects. So at the top we have a process message, report claim input, which consists of person activity input and claim activity input messages, and some objects from our business domain. of the sample is person and claim, and some types of claim, for example, auto claim to report car accident and property claim to report some damage on your house. The objects contain no behavior, they are just dumb transfer objects to transfer data between possibly remote components. So the idea is to compose specific objects to some message, service-specific or process-specific message, because you can't simply transfer a whole your database over the wire. So you have to address this issue too. It's kind of different compared to rich domain objects with behavior, where you normally have direct access to your data store and JPA and caching and lazy loading. In SOA, if you cut system boundaries, so there might be no lazy loading, and it's not suitable to transfer all the objects over the wire. So how bean validation can help to implement business constraints in this context in SOA and common data model. To better show concepts for the session, there's a demo provided. I provide a download link at the end of the session where you can download a sample application. And here's just introduction. We have one service portal. At the left side, there's our sample process and services exposed as UI components. And on the right side, this one is just our API exposed as SOAP web services. So if we get all the things right, we have both. We have API for our applications or systems, and we can leverage the same common data model and service definition. We work on the same model also on consumer side. And we don't have to duplicate our business constraints. And this diagram is validation in SOA used in this sample application. So normally the places where we have a need to enforce some business constraints. Yeah, we have some business service layer, which is kind of smart, can access backend systems. We have a business process layer. There might be a need to enforce process-specific business constraints here. We have normally also presentation layer. And to provide better user experience, we don't always delegate validation to a backend, but just to provide it on a place when the data is entered. And all these components consume definitions from our service data model. And there's also one JVM client. It's in a sample a simple unit test. So we look how to enforce bean validation using business constraints using bean validation API. So in more complex systems, there is a need to provide to enforce small and complex and simple business constraints. So we start from an attribute level and a simple not null or null required constraints, and move to a data object. Then look how to design a service operation specific and service specific constraints, and some validation which is also a process specific. So and use bean validation. So bean validation defines basically a meta model and API for entity validation, and one attractive feature, it's the API is not tied to a specific application tier or programming model, which is particularly suitable for SOA, because we have service provider and consumer layer, so we don't have to, we can rely to some specific application model, but we need usually a flexibility. On the other hand, bean validations are integrated with some other Java EE specifications like JPA and Java server faces. In this session, I show also example implemented in a sample application usage in Java server faces version 2 specification, not 1.2, but version 2. Let's start from one domain object, a person. So, bean validation specification provides also simple built-in constraint implementations. So the simplest one might be null or not null. So normally when we have one object, common data object, which is intended to be used everywhere, and some identifier. In this case, long ID, and normally it should be not null when we already have our person in a system. The person exists, and null when it's a new person. So to define this using bean validation, the validation groups can be used. And validation group is nothing else as a simple Java interface. Here are two validation group definitions. We have one group for new data to enforce, for example, identifiers, which get generated on a backend, and also update. In case of update, the consumer of our service has to provide some person with identifier, which is already in a system, and possibly update some data. So designing custom application groups to separate those, to address those concerns, already helps to design those kind of cases in our model. In the complex systems, there are normally not only simple constraints, but object graphs, so our data is kind of related to each other. For example, when we look at person activity input class, which is a message for all service operations in the sample, person activity input, it is composed from two common data model objects, person and address. So we just define as a business case when we create a person or update or do something with a person, so we have to provide the person information, address information. And our input message is a container for person activity service with two operations, create person and update person. And so we already defined some bean validation constraints in a person object, and when we send the data composed to a person activity message, we want also a person constraints to be validated. So by using annotation valid, we delegate, we enforce a validation of the object graph, dependent object. So we tell a bean validation facility to validate also a person or address to apply all. And we see here also two simple annotations, null and not null. So the second layer in validation might be in your business domain. we would like to check some service-specific constraints. For example, we have a common data object address, which is used everywhere in our system. And for claim activity service, when we're submitting a claim also with address, we just, our business wants to have also address and city information. And for person information, only zip is required. So as there is nothing in a specification which prohibits us to use Java interface as a validation group. So we have operations. So in this case, it might be useful to take our service operations, service interfaces as a validation group. So on this layer, you can specify service-specific constraints. So this not null is going to be enforced only for operations of claim activity service, and additionally, person activity service, all operations where address gets used requires also a zip. Zip? How do you pronounce it? Zip. Okay. So we just go back, person activity service and claim activity service class. It's the same as interface as we defined with operations, but we can use it also as a bean validation group. And we made some thoughts to design our services to partition our APIs. So why not to use it also to enforce service-specific constraints? The third case might be we want to do some semantic validation, which is needs to address information contained in one class. For example, we have an object claim, and it contains enumeration for supported claim times, which our system is going to accept, and might contain or should contain specific details for autoclaim, car accident details, or property claim, depending on a type. So in this case, we can design our custom bean validation annotations to check that. Custom constraint, claim constraint. How can bean validation constraint be? How can we define it? It's just custom annotation with where you can specify a target, use some interface keyword for annotation time. We have to provide mandatory attributes, message groups, and payload, and target where annotation can be put on a class, and also a validator validated by. So annotation, the constraints just only metadata to specify what we would like to validate, and the implementation is provided in a claim validator class in this case. And we basically implement all the method is valid, and we get access to object instance. In our case, is a claim. So having a claim object, we can simply implement business constraint with few if statements. One of the best practices as stated in supporting bean validation documents is to do not validate null values here, but use null not null constraints. So just the first statement is normally if claim is null or type null, so we just return true because we already defined those bean validation constraints. So, and bean validation validator just has to return true or false. Yeah, and constraint is violated, so it's false, otherwise true. When we move to the next layer, we have, when we're following the design principles in SOA, we have a process level validation, need for a process level validation. There might be some business constraints specific to some specific business process, like in our case, report claim process. So process normally composes all data. So when we send the data, it contains all data required for a process. So we can implement here some kind of, in this example, business rule or constraint that we do not accept auto claims from a person. So his last name starts with X. So kind of, it's not a real case, but just to show that we, having process data, we can access all the data contained in it. So there is a place to implement such kind of validations. And as you see, it's here's nothing else as a plain Java. So because our service model is intended to be portable. We don't want to introduce, we have like dependencies to other parts. So we just intention is to pack a service model as a jar and to consume it, use it on every layer. So possibly to use it on a process layer, on everywhere where Java is used. For example, Oracle SOA suite is also Java-based product, so it's possible to integrate all those operations which we implement here also or we can stay in Java and to continue to use it. So the process level validation constraint is for more complex semantic process specific validations, like in this case. And when we move towards complexity, of course, there's not always possible to implement everything in Java. We not always simply have all the data accessible. So, and there are some functionality in the backend systems which supports enforcement and validation of business constraints. And one example for the session is unique validation constraints. So normally, unique to check if a person exists, we need access to whole data. And when you remember layers, we can't simply get all persons to some part of a system just to check if a person exists. So we have somehow to delegate work to our backend system, a database or cluster or whatever it is. So those operations normally are resource intensive, and so it's a good practice to define a separate group for such operations, because you might not want always to enforce it, probably once on some layer. Depends on your business needs, but so we design, we want to check if a person exists and design a custom bean validation constraint, call it person unique constraint, provides a message for constraint violation, and enforce it in a group unique. Remember, our model already contains some simple implementation in Java, but in this case we don't have a possibility to provide implementation on a model layer, because model component, because model is going to be used in different environments. So sometimes we have access to a backend database directly. Sometimes we are on a service consumer side, so we have a remote access. So we just define one validator implementation and use context-dependent injection to inject a delegate to a real implementation, which is environment specific. So, but in this case, we are satisfied with our interface, so we just use the same interface. It's fine also for delegate validator, and in order to resolve cyclic references, put alternative annotation from context dependency injection. So it's because the framework would a container would start to inject all cyclic references itself. We look to implementation, and here's one implementation for this interface, our constraint validator for person unique constraint. So it's at a service provider layer where we normally have some access to some data store. In the sample is a data store stub in memory, some simple Java collections, but because we focus on the middleware in SOA, but this implementation might be to ask data store or data service, whatever you use it, JPI-based entity manager person exists. So the database checks for us really fast. And using the same validator on a service consumer layer, we don't have access to our data store, our data service. So we provide another implementation and inject some service required to enforce our unique constraints. So in this case, we also refer to context dependency injection, inject a person identification service, and implementation for this unique constraint looks almost the same, but in this case it's a remote service call. Yeah. So when you package our application and put our model, the implementation gets resolved to environment-specific one on the service provider layer with direct data store access, and on service consumer layer, remote access. How can validation be enforced? Bean validation, the most common case is a simple one. Bean validation API provides a method validate, where you can put an object annotated with bean validation constraints and a groups for which those constraints have to be validated. So you get a list of a set of constraint violation as a result, and normally it's good practice to translate it to some domain-specific business exception, because there might be some clients which are not only Java clients. So normally when you design services, you design also your business exception. In this, in a sample for the session, there is one generic business exception which can accumulate a list of constraint violations inside. So we can transfer violations from backend from service provider to service consumer, and to look what kind of specific business constraints were violated. So, if you would like to define the service operation specific constraints, so it might be useful to rely on also on inheritance of validation groups. For example, as you remember, you can define custom validation groups, and in this case, we create one interface, person activity update person, which extends default update groups. And the second one is person activity create person, which extends default and new unique interfaces. So we don't have, we just defined our validation group for service-specific operations. And here, for example, we're using this group on some Java Server Faces 2 page, and don't have to specify all validation groups which we would like to get validated for when a new person gets created. So, in this, here's also an example of integration. So bean validation is integrated with some other parts in Java E6, and one part is Java Server Faces 2. So if you using some Java Server Faces 2 based framework, you can use also attack validate bean, specify validation groups, and all values bound inside from a common data model in our case, all attributes, they get validated automatically. So we just need to tell, yeah, we would like to have a validation here. And we'll look also at the runtime behavior of the sample application and how Java Server Faces integration looks like. If you have any questions, just interrupt and ask. Yeah.
Maybe I'll defer this because I've got a fundamental problem with this whole. I'll defer it.
Okay. So, a demo application, so SOA Playground is going to be provided to practice on the concepts showed in the session, because it's a kind of broad topic. Common data model, SOA principles, and to narrow it to bean validation, I just created one NetBeans project, simple Java, no dependencies, just only play Java and Java EE standard. And we have all those typical parts. We have our service model, service stubs. They are just stubbed implementation for services, but normally we have some sophisticated implementation. We have a web service provider which exposes our business functionality as a web services, and on the server consumer side we have a web service proxy which is completely generated automatically based with VS import and Maven build and web application. Normally we have more services and processes, so hundreds, but this is a kind of top to the bottom example of concepts in this of a session. So summary. Okay. So let's look at a demo application. It's a little bit smaller screen, but so we have here a service model with our common data, and if you remember slides, for example, we can look at one data object. Person, and in this example is a person unique constraint defined, which message person already exists in unique group. Service model is structured also according to concepts showed in the session. We have package data, then false with one business exception. It is also designed to be reused on a service consumer side. So you doing like this, you avoid the transformations. You have only one model. You define your business objects, design the messages, and reuse them on all the layers. For example, service stubs is just a simple Java in-memory implementation of stubbed implementation to store data and get it back. And service web service provider is designed to expose our services as a web services in this case. But as you notice, a model doesn't contain any web service specific artifacts and dependencies. So if we would like to expose some process as a web services, just as simple as using NetBeans wizard to create a web service, and we inject our process implementation as a GB and delegate all calls to,
In our projects, a lot of our model classes are getting generated now from XSDs. How do you have a recommendation on how to handle that? Because you really can't use annotations because we don't want to keep on editing the generated classes. So, how does the framework address the issue that a lot of people use generated code now?
If you have XSD, so you're probably also using a web services, because of XSDs. And the concept here is to use Java, just simple Java, and let Java EE to generate XSDs for you. So XSD is not a single source of true, but it's a Java code with your constraints. Because regarding business constraints, you can't express all them in XSD, especially semantic ones. So you don't have if statements in XSD or delegated. So normally you, during the last years, there is one interesting essay from John Fowler, I think, a pattern tolerant reader. So the practice, during the practice, SOA practice, the problem was, it was figured out that using XSDs you can't all...
Well, I think in our case, a lot of the XSDs don't explicitly have all the constraints. So we basically are using the bean validation to enforce constraints on like string values and things like that.
But not all.
And so, what we've done is had to use the API to invoke a validation on top of these classes. And I don't know if that's the best practice.
It's the same in our case, but now I wouldn't use XSDs or VSTLs to design the services, but would start plain Java and implement this and let JEE to make XSDs for us on the fly. There are no XSDs here. I just showed one, but because if we put some not null, for example, enforcement in XSD, it prohibits us in some cases to get the data to a backend. A client just gets a validation; it's not null. So. It might be useful to get the data to a backend and to provide, let's say, feedback. You can log, you can make some.
I'm sorry. I think we're confusing two really different types of evaluation. I agree with you. If you need to unique constraint in the database, there's no way you're going to do it in the front end and the XML concept. The real problem is the assumption underlying your presentation is that you control the common data model. As you just said, you create the Java data model and then you generate the wisdom. But for a lot of us, the common data model is a vertical industry standard. Or Aegis or Star, or, they're HIPAA, whatever. They're all vertical industry standards. Those are all XSDs.
Yeah.
They're not specified as
Yeah, in this case, it's of course it's not possible to start from a green field. So if you don't have a control about your common data model, so you normally also don't get advantage of which a common data model provides. So you have to transform your data from standard to your specific.
No, there was a birds of feather JaxWS session yesterday, and they are thinking of taking all the normal schema constraints and turning them into JSR 303 constraints in the generated model in the next JaxWS version. One of the questions I raised, and I think everybody here would be interested in this, is there some kind of an annotation we can add, XML comment in some namespace to the schema itself for business constraints, right? So that it automatically, it should be possible to write a plugin even today for JaxB, compiler for XJC.
Yeah.
Able to read that XML. It's in some namespace. I haven't designed it, but it's in some namespace, and it automatically maps it into bean validation.
Yeah.
That would really solve the problem. Because most of us are contract first generator. We have to be, because that object model doesn't come is an XSD.
Just to recapture a little bit, there are some efforts. For example, if you design your constraints in bean validation constraints, it might be possible to generate also XSD on XSD side, those types and so on. But I think it's not possible to simply express everything in XSD now. So if you can't express everything and start, you have a possibility to start. So it might be better not to start at all, but to use a tolerant XSDs without any constraint, just a standard types.
Here is my problem. In terms of expressing constraints, if I happen on the wire, it's all XML, right? It so happens that XSDs are very rich in terms of the constraints, nillable and maxsuckers, minsuckers. I got facets coming out of my ears. And if I have cross-constraint validation, I can always use XSLT with XPath to check those things. I can check a lot of things right at the XML level itself. Why do I need bean validation? Now, there are certain things you pointed out that I can't quite do at the moment. I agree.
Yeah.
But for a lot of it, I can do it at the XML level itself, just using nothing more than XPath and XML validation.
Yeah, it's a good point, but as I told you, first you can't check everything, so you duplicate some, and you doing like this, it's not always XSD, and we are still, that's a point. You can use the same model made in Java also in a single Java virtual machine for normal. It's not always remote usage, so you have options, like doing this. Relying on web service standards, XSDs, it introduces a dependency normally so it's the only way to use it as a web service.
Not necessarily.
Okay, you can enforce also.
The business layer is completely different. It's no different from my doing a web application. My domain model doesn't depend on what is presented. I just get a form, I transform it to my domain model. The domain model is blissfully independent of the
you can enforce also with JavaC. And second point, bean validation provides a possibility to use externalized configuration for not only annotations. Annotations is a standard option, but the second option is to use metadata. So it might be alternative to use as a metadata, but it's the same normally.
The problem is with the metadata is that you can't, you're generating this code, so you don't want to have to add metadata to the generated code. So what is the best, do you have any recommendations on people who get given generated classes that you have to validate against? You have to validate the classes, but you don't want to modify the classes. So do you end up just using the API only and not using annotations? And just writing validators that use the programmatic validation API?
I would use a programmatic Java-centric approach, and I would generate Java classes with annotations from a model, but use XSDs or VSTLs as one of options, if it's possible, if you have a control about those things. And it's our experience because we just also started with XSDs, and the last years. And due to constraints and XSDs, we sometimes in one project with one customer, we couldn't provide functionality needed because, for example, SOA suite, BPL process execution language here, it rejected the messages because of constraints in XSDs. And we would like to get them to a backend to provide all the other validations. So I would...
Like another case would be like you have an address, but you might have a US address or a UK address.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't apply necessarily the same validations against the same fields on the same class. So,
mm-hmm. So the groups of your business domain, we just, we looked, you can control enforcement about constraints and user groups. So if you have some local groups or address specific, so localization.
The problem with validations, let me give you a classic example.
Mm-hmm.
If you take an industry standard like star, and you take address, it's the usual, address line 1, address line 2, zip city code, blah, blah, blah. The real problem here is Canada uses something else other than zip. So what it comes down to is, if it is China, I always require address line 2. There is simply, there is just so much business validation, right? But the schema itself is a generic schema from some standards body. They make everything optional. Everything in their world is optional. Only I know through taking a slice in my business what is required for a particular web service call. So it really is almost an impossible problem in terms of annotations or anything. You really have no choice but to write custom validations that know your business specific processes. I have broken my head over this for 3 years and I've gotten nowhere. I don't control the schemas.
It's not always one size fits all. So I think if you don't have a control about your schema, so normally you have some kind of front end, for example, service bus or transforming to your common data models. Yeah. So this case might be at your place when you rely on some external schema where you don't have control. And the second point, normally those schemas are not so IT friendly. They are, like you mentioned, a lot of fields are optional. So they don't express semantic whole constraints. And I know, for example, a business analyst, we are just designing a common data model in Germany to define one person which is immigrating to a country. So we spent 1 year and came out with some schema which is not usable directly, which can't be directly reused. It's aimed to facilitate data exchange countrywide between all offices in this subject, so immigration. But from a technical point of view or design or IT point, so good practices of modeling and design, it's not usable. So there is a transformation then normally. Internally, these principles are used between the systems, but and there's one component which transforms from this not usable schema. Yeah.
If you get an XSD that has service operator, assume we're talking about a sub-service call, you get a whistle with XSDs. So that whistle defines your operation and inputs and outputs to the operation. So what they're saying is, if you generate code from that, you get stuck with what gets generated. Would it be possible? And then you have to write the annotations yourself, and then every time they change the whistle, you regenerate and you lose everything, so you have to do it again. Is what they're saying, I think. Is it possible to do it maybe at the higher level? Because we saw different levels. There's at the model level, like at the actual person class level.
Yeah.
There's operation level.
Tailor it.
Or maybe can you just take these groups and put them, I don't know, at some higher level where you don't actually have to change the generated model classes.
There is a solution to this problem. And it turns out the problem is actually JAX-B. Because suppose you are using an older OXM framework like Castor or something, okay? In that case, you're not generating it. You don't have to. You're just mapping your XML fields to your object field. That means you do have a canonical object model independent of the schema because you never compiled the schema. So you can add the annotations to your class as much as you want. If the schema changes, you go change the mapping file and you're done. This is a fundamental weakness of JAX-B, not necessarily of what you're saying.
Yeah, it's JAX-B, JAX-VS. They are so normally web service, or not only web service, but normally used in SOAP and web service. So so it's VSL to Java or Java to VSL discussion. So in this case, it's more so Java to VSL. So VSL is only a technical artifact used, but like we see, we get VSL. It's generated by JAX-VS implementation, and we have all schemas, but we don't explicitly design them. And we designed our common data model, objects, constraints, service interfaces, using a minimal set of to express information, just only minimal set, the name, operation name, data objects sent back and forth. So
the same problem arises in a different way. One thing you do is you map your XML to some object, and then you want to use JPA to persist that object.
Yeah.
Well, you can't put JPA annotations into this class because every time you recompile it, you lose your JPA annotation. It's the same problem.
Yeah.
It's coming at you in different ways.
I wouldn't put any JPA annotations model because I don't know if it's a JPA is going to be used to persist. You know, so this is for a middle aim to go over layers and to be used everywhere. But I might use some other store like in this memory or NoSQL or not only SQL or relation in database. It's not defined. It might go through a messaging system. So if I would put a JPA or rely on some spec on this part, so I have to take dependencies everywhere. You know, it should be very thin, plain Java. And bean validation is also thin because of implementations in Java. So it's a portable. It's not a heavyweight.
Really?
So that's but I can understand also your.
I would argue whether it's bean validation or JPA or anything, object models should be pure. They should know nothing about these external aspects. To me, persistence is a cross-cutting aspect, validation is a cross-cutting aspect. Your object model shouldn't know anything about how it is validated or how it is persisted. It doesn't know and it shouldn't care.
So true, but maybe you can use the validations at
Yeah,
a
it's
model level.
license. I just a question.
Just quickly, with the last couple seconds.
Yeah.
So, what's the future of validation? Like, we have expect the 4.3 stack, I guess, or was it the Hibernate validator, the 4.3? What's coming? Is there anything new coming up?
There's a drop tomorrow morning.
Yeah, it's current state. I think bean validation 1.0 final release. It's a production, and new is bean validation 1.1. It's work in progress, and current state is 1.1 alpha 1 early draft available, and it's open. So if somebody has to like to participate, just visit the website openness. And the main parts, dependency injection, is going to be regulated because in this sample, I just implemented service provider interface, not showed, but if you download a sample, you would find some code which injects the implementation of the person unique validator. And method validations also might save. But let's answer to your question. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So the question was if an object is not already instantiated but doesn't contain all values, how you provide the default values. I would like to say you normally can rely on some integration for bean validation, like in Java server faces, where you can put a tag and on a post it gets validated. But it's not the only way. The most common way to call API when needed. Yeah, validate and provide object to be validated. Yeah. So then you are in control about the time when one would like to enforce a validation. Yeah. So then your objects have a state where you think, okay, now it's the time to validate it. I don't know if UI or some other client. So you just call validate and get a list of constraint violations. So it's that was a.
So just to be clear, let's say I don't want one value to be, I want one value to be true or false depending on another value. That value that is true or false may or may not.
Dependent on the other. Optional, then the other one, contextual. Mm-hmm. That's a case on a class level validation where you can have access and can write conditional statements. So that might be a case if this, for example, there was one slide with claim type. I just go back to answer your question, maybe interesting. When you have a claim type auto, so you require to have auto claim object and it's a property, so you expect to get a property object, so conditional.
So it is okay to change, it's not against the product to change the auto
Yeah. Yeah. We can continue also a discussion in case of interest after a session, so I just formally close it. And if you would like to get a sample, just provide links. I think the best way, just look at Twitter. I will post a link with where presentation and sample application can be downloaded with the concepts which I just presented today. So thank you also for participating at my session. It was a pleasure to present it, and thank you for coming. We can continue discussing after that. I have time. Thank you.